Hello, everybody. I am here today to talk to you about Chapter 8 about disability. And let's get started. All right. So, oops, that's not the first slide. There we go. So this is what we are doing today. And rearrange something. There we go. And we're going to cover the basics, the categories, the history, and social work as it relates directly to this topic. I do just want to note that this is a very brief lecture, and these topics are covered in your book. But again, just a very brief overview in one chapter. There is a very deep body of research and a very deep body of philosophy and activism around these topics. This is a field that is very quickly progressing. Okay, so let's talk about our basics. The bird's eye view is that disability in some form affects over 1 billion people in the world. People with challenges are often marginalized, and that can come in lots of different forms and lots of different levels of, obviousness. They can be really, really clear, or it can be very subtle. Stereotypes around disability really are very persistent. They're very difficult to overcome for a lot of different kinds of disabilities. I will say that for others, things are coming along. So, for example, mental health disabilities, the stereotypes around those are changing significantly, but there is still a lot of work to do. For us as social workers and future social workers, our role is to work to not just to equalize access, but to make access equitable, right? So if you recall the difference between equal and equitable, equitable is making it so that everybody has the same level of opportunities, even if they started from different places. Equal just means you give everybody the same stuff, and if they started way back, behind where other people started, well, too bad for them, right? So it is not just about equalizing, it's also about equitalizing. It's not actually a word. You get the idea. Okay, so statistics. So the statistics on the leading categories contributing to American disability, adjusted for the adjusted life years. It's very interesting to take a look at this because, um, neuropsychiatric disorder just means mental health stuff plus neurological stuff, right? And, a lot of people have both. A lot of people have overlapping categories to start with, right? So like if you have a syndrome, or just if you think about the sheer numbers of people with disabilities, there's going to be a lot of people with multiple disabilities. So like I'm looking at this list, I have at least 3 of these. And it's very there's a lot of overlap is where I'm going with that. Okay, so terminology and definition, I think it probably makes more sense to do definition first, in the sense that the definition of disabled is not that difficult to understand. It does involve a chronic condition. So, if it's not a chronic condition, you can say temporarily disabled, or, usually people just say injured or ill or whatever, to indicate that it's a temporary issue. Disabled really does have a meaning attached to it, that it is a chronic long-term condition. You know, technically speaking, and here we're talking about, you know, the American system. When we're going to define it, let's say if we're defining it for Medicaid, the impairment lasts at least 12 months, right? And it limits major life activity. So, you know, there is space in there for folks who don't meet those criteria, but still have, you know, impairments or challenges or all of that, but they don't necessarily meet the definition in the strict sense of disabled. So terminology, I want to talk about this a little bit. So, you know, there are various different sets of languages that you can use to discuss um, you know, disabilities or mental health or whatever. You know, as a person with disabilities, I don't have any problem with that word, so that's what I use. But a lot of people prefer challenge. You know, and there are lots of other words that we can use, but the most important thing to do is to let the person that you're working with lead you, right? It's not up to you to decide what words to use. That's not your choice. The choice always lays with the person that you're working with the client that you're working with. And you know, the number one thing that I think I would say is to emphasize always person over condition. So I put here with poor editing skills, person with language. So, for example, you know, she is a person with schizophrenia. You know, it's very different from saying she's a schizophrenic, right? Because when you do that, what you do is you erase all their other identities, right? Like you can have disability be a big part of your identity, but in no universe is it your only identity. So when you say, you know, she's a schizophrenic, you're erasing other identities. And we do this with other things. We don't say, you know, she is a person with womanhood, right? But the difference is that, you know, between saying she is a woman and she is a schizophrenic is that there's connotations to a disability label that, you know, we want to be really aware of, right? And there's a history of erasure, right? There's a history, and we'll talk about this more when we go forward in the lecture, but there's a history of defining people by their disability and no other criteria, and that is the problem. So not only are we asking the people that we're working with what term they prefer to use, but we are using the proper language in all settings. So it's not like you go to work and you use the proper person first language um, in that context, and then you go home and you know, say she's schizophrenic. No, 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 no. We have to use the proper language in all settings. Two reasons. One, the people around us are picking up on how we behave, right? Like we always impact the language of the people around us, always. And so if we want other people to change how they speak, then we need to speak that way too. And we need to message, let's say they already use the proper language. We need to message that it's not only important, but it's automatic, right? It's part of how we think. It's not performative. It's not something that we do because we're supposed to. It's something that we do because it is part of how we think about things. And at first it might be performative, right? At first it might feel like kind of a jumble in your mouth, and it takes a little bit of work to get into that habit. But once it's a habit, it becomes automatic, right? So so that's one reason. The other reason is that there's some interesting research out there that basically says that what we say impacts what we believe. And if you hear that and you're like, yes, duh. I want you to think a little more deeply about it, because the when we are casual about how we speak about anything, and we are trying to hold two different views of it, one in our head and one in our speech, that is very difficult to do. And the things that you say are very, very, very powerful to impacting how you think. So for example, if you use derogatory language when you're speaking, but when you're referring to yourself, for example, if you say, I'm so stupid, when you do something wrong, then there actually is a message and a mechanism for solidifying that message in your thinking, right? Like, you might say it and intend, only to be joking, or, to be self-depreciating and all of that, and that's fine. But you need to understand that it actually does have a real impact on how you truly have a self-concept, right? So whenever I hear people say like, "Oh, I'm so dumb," I always stop them, and I say like, "Oh, no, 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 we're not gonna be mean to ourselves, like that we wouldn't say that to somebody else. We're certainly not going to say it to ourselves." It does have an impact. There's lots of research out there about it, actually. So like, the positive self-talk is really, really, really important. And like, so positive other talk is also really important, right? Like, what if we refer to each other respectfully, it will help us be respectful also internally, right? It'll help us bring our words and our mindset into alignment. Okay. So, hold on a second. Okay. So we have a few different types of disabilities. And like I said, I use that word because it doesn't bother me as a person with disabilities. But other people can use other words. We have to pick something. So a co-occurring refer to a client having more than one. And like I said before, that is really, really common. Categorical challenges are going to be ones that are significant impairments with developmental delays. So, like you have a sensory impairment, you have a mental illness paired along with a developmental delay. This is really, really, really common. That can be caused by a lot of different things. We'll talk about that in a later slide. But and then we have functional challenges. So those are limits to people's ability to perform their daily activities, and they can be helped with assistive devices and technology. And these things do not necessarily exist in silos. I have a family member who has, categorical challenges and functional challenges, and uses assistive devices and technology. And, the important thing to understand is, like, these categories exist, but there's a lot of overlap. Okay, so, all right, categories. Let's talk about those. So the general categories are developmental, mental, cognitive, and physical mobility. So let's talk about that. So developmental challenges, again, there's very specific definitions for this, and that has a lot to do with, how we categorize for the medical establishment, and make decisions about payments and Medi-Cal and all of that stuff. So Severe chronic disability that appears before the age of 22, right? If it appears after the age of 22, it could be exactly the same thing, but it's not going to be categorized as a developmental challenge, right? So age matters. It may be genetic or it could be caused by other factors. So what does that mean? So when we look at the examples, um, there's a lot of controversy about what causes autism, right? But, you know, we can set that one aside and then look at other things that, for example, cerebral palsy, there's lots of different ways to develop cerebral palsy. One of them is birth trauma, right? There's other ways to develop it, right? Epilepsy is another really good example of this. So, you can have epilepsy because you have a difference in your brain that is part of your genetic makeup, or you can have epilepsy because birth trauma, or you can have epilepsy because injury, all sorts of things. But fetal alcohol syndrome, not genetic at all. Okay, it is all about the environment created by the mother in pregnancy. And and then you have things like Fragile X and Prader-Willi, and those have no real, significant environmental component at all. Those are all genetic. So, and Down syndrome as well. So like the the categories, depending on the specific thing that we're talking about, some of them have components both genetic and environmental. Some of them are mainly one or the other. We can talk on a different day about the diathesis stress model of disease development, but the bottom line is, if something is in your genetic structure, and it is a single, or if it's chromosomal or whatever, you will develop that disease. There are not a lot that are like that. Most of them do involve some environmental trigger, but there are a few. Um, Down syndrome is a good example. Okay. So physical mobility challenge. So this is kind of an interesting distinction that not everybody understands. So physical challenge limits one or more basic physical activity, right? But mobility limits function of moving, right? And so, you can have something that limits your physical activities because you are, for example, exhausted all the time. You don't have a functional limitation to moving at like you would if you had an amputated limb. Okay, so neurocognitive impairment. It's a block to the cognition process, such as intellectual disabilities or challenges. So, the this used to be called mental retardation, and unfortunately in the DSM it is still called mental retardation because they have yet to come up with something better. Guess what? There are a lot of better terms than mental retardation, which is just a horrible term for something that you know, is has a lot of different sources, can come from a lot of different places, but that terminology carries a lot of really negative connotation. It is time to replace it. Unfortunately, in the DSM, it is not yet replaced. So there is a very wide range, and there's just not this is a very broad category, right? So there's not a great way to like narrow it down or discuss it in specific terms without speaking about, a specific disorder or a specific patient. So learning differences, um, they, they are neurological disorders. They're skill-based. There are a lot of them, and these are tricky, right? Because some of them are very clear and easy to see and easy to identify. Some of them, might never be identified. You might be going through your entire life like this, and there's help out there for you, and you don't know that anything's wrong. You just think you're bad at math or bad at reading or whatever. And that is not the case, right? There's specific criteria around learning difference. Um, you can, for a lot of these, the support is really about strategies and building skills and that sort of thing. So ADHD, really good example of this, very, very common learning difference. And I I am somebody who struggles with ADHD, and I have a lot of students who struggle with ADHD as well. And I put together an entire lecture about how to, like, sort of navigate college with ADHD like symptoms. Whether or not you're diagnosed with ADHD doesn't necessarily matter. If you're struggling with the same kind of challenges, then the same kinds of strategies will help. um the last category is TBI, right? So a blow to the head, penetration of the skull. We hear a lot about this now in the aftermath of the wars that we have recently had. So it can have a wide range of impacts, and some of them are really subtle and some of them are really obvious. Some of them take a long time to develop. Some of them are really immediate. It's a very, very difficult thing to put your finger down on. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about history. So, like I mentioned before, folks in this population were often feared and seen as pariahs, right? And so they were ostracized or treated differently or, abused, whatever, hidden away often. And they historically were cared for by families. And some of that care was really good and some of that care was not very good, but it certainly was not standardized and it was not medicalized, right? It was dealt with um in the home, at home. And the treatment really did vary a lot by who your family was, right? Class, race, gender, that sort of thing, and who you were, right? Um, the treatments, I put that in quotes because, the treatments vary, right? And like lobotomies, removing a part of the brain in sort of a, non-specific type way, were still being performed in the 60s. It's not that long ago, right? This is in living memory. So, treatments have often been crude at best. Okay. So, Um, if you'll recall back to the history of social work, you will remember institutionalization. And this was a period of time where folks with disabilities of all different kinds, but mainly, mental health issues, were I think warehoused is a fair term to use, were warehoused and not really necessarily treated, not just because we didn't really understand what was going on, but also had very few tools with which to deal with it. Medication, that sort of thing, just not that much to address it. And there was a big move towards institutionalization, and that in the 60s mainly. And the idea was to move these folks back into the community and provide them support in a community setting, which would have been great if that had been funded, right? And it just wasn't really funded. There was not a lot of money for that. And so what you see happen is a corresponding boom in homelessness, right? And in poverty, right? So the institutions still exist, but they don't have, relatively speaking, there's not a lot of people in them. And there has to be a balance between holding people who don't need to be held and can be helped in a community setting, and um being uh not serving people who need higher levels of care, right? So anyway, the numbers of people who are institutionalized is greatly reduced. Um, and again, that would be fine. Um, except for the fact that community supports were traditionally lacking. Now in California, we have a law called the Mental Health Services Act. And there are lots and lots of laws, and California is one of the better places to need services on this level, because we do have, relatively speaking to to in comparison to other states, a pretty good strong web of service. But in California, one of the major laws that we have is called the Mental Health Services Act, and it provides for a lot of those community supports. So if you want to learn more about what is going on in your community, in those community support areas, you can go and Google your county that you live in and Mental Health Services Act, MHSA plan. And every county is required to have a 3-year plan and an annual update, and it will list out every service that is funded by the Mental Health Services Act. Pretty cool portion of the law, actually. Okay, so I think we covered this, except for the part about self-determination. And like, this is the part where we need to make sure that we are talking about the idea that people have a right to self-determination regardless of whether they are struggling with disabilities or not, right? And I shouldn't have to say that out loud, but I do, because we think about things like 5150, right? So in California, the section of the law that allows people to be involuntarily committed to mental health treatment is called 5150. And it's limited, right? It's a 72-hour hold, but we are taking away somebody's liberty, and we have to be really careful about that. And it's based on this concept of, are you a genuine risk to yourself or someone else? And that's a reasonable standard. Most states have, I think all states have that standard. But who is deciding it and evaluating it varies a little bit. In California, the police are the ultimate deciders of that. And are they the correct choice? Like, they obviously they're getting input, but they're the ones that mainly can write the 5150, not exclusively, but mainly. So there's an issue around self-determination here, because anybody who's ever been held on a 5150 will tell you that maybe they acknowledge that it saved their lives. However, not a single person who has ever been on a 5150 that I have ever met has said, like, that was a good experience. That was an experience that helped me recover. It might have kept them alive until that exact crisis was no longer a crisis. But there's a distinction between waiting it out and really, like, getting settled and getting real help. And, like, I think that that we need to acknowledge that 5150 is a really important tool, but make no mistake, it is not to be used lightly, in many ways. Being put on a 5150 hold, can damage people more, right? Even if it keeps them alive, it can be very damaging. Okay, so in terms of social work and being supportive in our roles as social workers. So you know, the discrimination around the social stigma of physical and mental disabilities is, alive and well. Are there laws to prevent it? Yes. Does it prevent all of it? No. Are there lots of ways to still discriminate against people despite the fact that there's a web of laws? Absolutely. Stigmatized people um lose their status. And also, I just want to point out, just to go back a little bit, there are lots of ways in which stigma is built in to our laws, is built into our rules. So for example, if you are a member of the military and you have a gun issued to you, and you have it becomes known that you are suffering from certain mental health challenges, you will have your sidearm removed. Now, to some extent that makes sense. If you are actively suicidal, do we want you to have a gun in your house? No, we don't. Um, but there's a wide range of things that you could be suffering from that do not involve really having your necessary part of your job removed from you, right? And so, like, if you are, for example, a Marine, and you carry a sidearm every day to work, if you have your sidearm removed, you can't do your job, right? And then you end up removed from your ability to do your day-to-day job. And even though you might be put into a different job, all of the people who work around you are like, hey, where's your sidearm? Like, what's up, man? And then you end up in a really, really bad place. So, stigma is alive and well, and it absolutely prevents people from seeking help. Absolutely, 100%, right? So, we have some issues around access, and assistive technology is a really good example of this. So, if you think about somebody who has very limited funds for where they live, if they find themselves bound to a wheelchair, and they're living in a place with that assistive technology, right, with that wheelchair, and the doorways are too small or something, like, we have real problem here. And so, like, it's not just the cost of getting the right chair, it's also the cost of living somewhere where what you need is accommodated, right? So it's not just one side of that. It's not just the technology itself, right? um so for us as social workers, as always with everything, it's our job to be a watchdog, right? To help clients find the supports that they need, connect them to the supports that they need, and help them get the access that they require, right? It's our job to advocate. So the ADA, just to talk a little bit more about laws, um, the ADA defines conditions using a four-stage framework. We were talking before about, like, the definition of the word disability. this is where that sort of comes in, is the ADA. And, we have to talk about what it is that you have, what your impairment is, the functional limitation, right? And like we have to remember the ADA is a big law, is very complex. You are not entitled to protection under the ADA simply because you've been diagnosed with a special need. It needs to have impairment. It needs to meet the definitions, right? So it's important to remember that, right? So a lot of the stuff that we've discussed here is covered by the ADA, but not all of it. And the main goal of the ADA is to prevent workplace discrimination, right? And discrimination also, like in communities and schools, all sorts of things, but it is hugely about workplace discrimination. Okay, almost done. So we have to remember always, and it's sometimes easier to forget when we're working with folks with disabilities, that it is our job to facilitate access and to assist clients to meet their own needs. It is not our job to do things for people. Like that removes people's own autonomy, right? We are facilitating access. We are, and when we do that, we are demonstrating respect, right? And we need to make sure that we're using our strengths-based perspective to help people find their own ability to advocate for themselves. Like our job is as facilitator, not as leader, right? Our client is the one who's leading, right? So that is the end of this lecture. And during the year, my office hours are from 5 to 6 p.m. During the summer, they are by appointment. So, if you want to discuss any of this further, please do let me know. And I hope to see you in office hours soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.